the door and Miss Deering's out. I'll call you back.
Do that. Bye.
Bye. Come in.
Mr. Vance?
Yes?
I'm Grace Butler.
How do you do?
I'm sorry I wasn't home as I said I'd be. I just can't stay in that house anymore now that Michael...
That's understandable. Please come in, Mrs. Butler.
Thank you. May I sit here?
Please do. Mrs. Butler, when I spoke to you on the telephone, you told me your husband had been threatened by a mysterious Professor Powell. Mrs. Butler, was your husband very wealthy?
Yes, I suppose you would say he was wealthy.
And you inherit most of his money?
Yes. You're not trying...
I'm not trying to do anything except establish a clear picture of this case. You also told me of a threat made by a Dr. Stanley James, to whom your husband refused to lend money.
Yes. He hated my husband. And my husband expected trouble, Mr. Vance. Before he left home this morning, he put a loaded revolver in his pocket.
Yes, I know. We've withheld that fact from the newspaper, but we found the gun. Now all that remains to be done is to find your husband's murderer.
This is District Attorney Markham. The Butler murder case opened with the death of Dr. Michael Butler. Philo Vance reasoned that he was killed by an injection of poison into his body, and later investigation proved this correct. Vance's suspects include Professor Powell, an extortionist, Dr. Butler's widow, and another dentist, Stanley James. My secretary has told me that Vance is on the way into my office, and I have been waiting for him. He should be stepping...
Markham, my friend, how are you?
Fine, Vance, fine. I imagine you have news for me.
No, not yet. I took a cab here to see your notes on the routine questioning of suspects. I have an idea they're going to be very important. May I?
Well, they're Sergeant Heath's notes, but certainly, Vance, they're right here. Here you are.
Thank you. Dr. Stanley James admits he left his house early on morning of murder. Claims he went to library. No corroboration. Let's see now. Mrs. Butler asleep when husband left house. Collapsed when asked to identify body, and on recovery asked that she not be made to look at it. Permission granted. Complete check of her background and associates reveals no hint of trouble between her and doctor. Well, Markham, as usual, our friend Heath is quite thorough.
Yes, he is. Oh, excuse me, Vance. Hello, Markham speaking.
Mr. Markham, this is Dr. Milstead, room 420, Johnson Building.
Yes, Doctor.
Mr. Markham, a man who calls himself Professor Powell just telephoned me to be in my office at 8 o'clock tonight. And not to notify the police or what happened to Dr. Butler would happen to me, too. You've got to protect me.
We will, Dr. Milstead. Standing next to me right now is Philo Vance. When the professor calls upon you, Mr. Vance will be there, too.
It's just 8 o'clock, Mr. Vance, and to be honest about it, I'm a little nervous.
No need to be, Dr. Milstead. I'm quite sure I can handle our friend Professor Powell when he arrives.
Oh, I'm sure you can. And thank you, Vance, for coming here.
No trouble at all. I've been wanting to meet the professor for some time.
Oh, that must be he now. Professor Powell?
It is I, Doctor.
Will you come in here, please?
Oh, thank you, Doctor. Thank you. I thought you had another patient in here with you, and I didn't want to interrupt.
I think you might prefer talking to me, Professor. My name is Vance, Philo Vance.
Philo Vance? Well, I have an odd compliment for you, Mr. Vance. You, the mere fact that you were in this city, postponed my coming here for several years.
Oh, thank you.
Of course, I realize it is no coincidence that finds you here in this office, Vance.
Dr. Milstead, would you leave Professor Powell and myself alone for a bit?
Oh, of course, Mr. Vance. I'll wait out in the reception office.
Thank you, Doctor.
Not at all.
Well, Vance, this is indeed a compliment to my intelligence. Apparently, you wanted to meet me, eh?
Definitely. I'm rather glad about it, by the way. You see, I think you're a killer, and I'm going to prove it.
You mean Dr. Butler, of course. Well, it's quite possible that I didn't kill him, you know. He must have found out by now about his wife and that other dentist who hated him.
As a matter of fact, I have. My compliments on providing suspects along with your murders, Professor Powell. Very considerate of you. By the way, what are your intentions in regard to Dr. Milstead?
There are so many other doctors, Vance, and after all, Dr. Milstead did bring us together. He's perfectly safe, believe me.
I'm sure he will be, now. Well, Professor Powell, I'm certain that this is au revoir. But we'll meet again.
Believe me, we will, Vance. But the next circumstance may not be so pleasant for you. Frankie, my boy, we must think of something completely different. Completely wonderful for our Mr. Philo Vance.
You do the thinking, Professor. That's your department.
Thank you, Frankie. Now, let me see. There must be something that Vance can't possibly suspect. Something that is completely foolproof. He's a clever man, Frankie. A very clever man.
If he's that clever, let's leave him alone.
No. He's so clever I can't afford to. It can't be anything ordinary. Nothing obvious.
No.
Must be something I work out in careful detail. Something I... Frankie, I have it.
Hold on to it, boss.
I never forget anything, Frankie. Listen.
Yeah?
This is perfect. I'm convinced Vance is a menace. A definite menace to my future plans. I must do away with him.
Oh, it sounds like you're in my department now, Pop.
Hardly. Although you'll be called on to help.
Sure.
Frankie, Vance drives a 1944 Stanton convertible, dark green.
Well, a lot of people drive green Stantons.
That's right. Therefore, it shouldn't be hard for you to get me a car like that.
What do I do? Heist it or buy it?
It doesn't really matter as long as you get it.
I'll consider it gotten. What happens then?
Then I'm going to take a photograph of the inside of Vance's car.
Yeah?
If there's a worn spot on the flooring, I'm going to duplicate it in the car you get me. I'm going to check his speedometer and fix our car the same way. I'm going to duplicate everything in Vance's car.
You mean there'll be no way of knowing it ain't his own car when Vance climbs in?
That's exactly what I mean.
Uh-huh.
And then, Frankie,
Yeah?
after I make our car an exact duplicate of Vance's, I'm going to fasten an explosive device to the starter and switch our car with his.
How about keys, boss? He's going to know it ain't his car from the keys.
I think not.
Huh?
Vance has his car delivered from the garage. The keys are left in it. It would be a simple matter to put his key ring in our car.
Hey, Professor, all I got to do is get a car like Vance's and this thing can't miss, huh?
That's right. You know, Frankie, I'm not sure as to whether Vance subscribes to my theory about the fallacy of prolonging life. But it would be a very good thing for him at the moment if he were reconciled to it.
Gee, Professor, I sure did a good job of getting a car that was just like Vance's and of fixing the inside just like his, didn't I? Huh? Yeah, take a look at that bus in front of his door there, the one we're in, and you couldn't tell them apart. I even put his own radio back in our car.
You did an admirable job, Frankie.
Thanks.
Now, all that remains is to wait here until Vance leaves the building. Tell me once more what you did so I know there's no slip-up.
Yeah, okay. After I drove the car to Vance's place and fixed the gimmick to the starter, like you showed me, I drove Vance's own car up the block and called you. You hopped the cab and came down. Here we are in Vance's own car.
Good. Very good, Frankie. Here comes Vance and his friend. They're just turning out of their building now.
Yeah, boss, and they're heading for the car we gimmicked up.
I don't think it would be wise for us to be in this vicinity after the explosion, Frankie. Perhaps it would be better if we left right now.
Okay, boss, you say so. Well, here goes. On with the ignition.
You better hurry, Frankie.
Yeah.
Vance and Malcolm are getting into this car.
On with the starter now. Here we go.
Markham, I think Powell is still breathing. He is. Powell. Professor Powell.
The doctor said Professor Powell would probably regain consciousness before he died, Vance. Looks as if he was right.
Yes, it does. He shows signs of coming out of the results of that explosion. I'm going to talk to him. Powell. Professor Powell.
Hello, Vance. How did this happen to me?
It was simple, Powell. I didn't fall for your trick of switching cars. So when your man here went to telephone you, I switched the cars back to their original status. Pushing the rigged car and not using the starter.
You saw what Frankie had done with the cars, Vance.
Well, I didn't actually witness it, but I did look in what was supposed to be my car a little while ago. It seems your man forgot one detail. I didn't think you'd trust the actual work to an underling.
No, I guess that was a mistake. But I do have the satisfaction of having committed a murder and not being caught. That is something, Vance.
You killed Dr. Butler?
Of course. I killed him, and you never knew it was I. You never would have been able to prove it. You weren't really so brilliant, were you, Vance?
He's gone, Vance.
Yes, I know.
Well, his death did us a lot of good. It got rid of him and cleared up the Dr. Butler murder case. We know now that it was Powell who killed Butler.
Do we, Markham? I think not. I think you'd be very wise if you arrested the real murderer, Mrs. Grace Butler. Let's start with the motive, Markham. It was money. Dr. Butler was very rich. But Mrs. Butler was continually being embarrassed by lack of cash. When she heard about Professor Powell's threat to her husband, she decided to make sure the doctor died, knowing Powell would be blamed.
That's reasonable enough.
Of course. So she stole out of the house as he was dressing on the morning of the murder, came to his office, and waited for him with the hypodermic in her hand.
She hid the hypo in her hand, put her arms around her husband as if to embrace him, and shoved the needle into him. Death was practically instantaneous.
Yes. Then she went through the routine of putting the hypodermic into the sterilizer, trying to eliminate all traces of the poison.
Well, that's all very well, of course, Vance, but why did Professor Powell insist he killed Dr. Butler?
The colossal conceit of the man was responsible, Markham. He wanted us to think that he had committed a murder which couldn't be pinned on him. If he left that thought with us, well, he was content to die.
Yes. Knowing his philosophy, that isn't hard to understand. Now, one more thing, Vance. What made you suspect Mrs. Butler?
Something very definite, Markham. She told us she was asleep when Butler left the house the morning of his death. She never looked at the body, yet she knew her husband had put a loaded revolver in his coat pocket. She couldn't have known it unless she did see him that morning. When she denied seeing him, it could only be for the purpose of covering up the fact that she killed him.
Tell me one more thing, Vance. How did you know that your car had been switched so that you, in turn, could switch it back? The cars were exact duplicates.
Yes, they were, Markham, all except for one little detail. The gas gauge in my car wasn't working. It didn't register at all. When I got into the car in front of my door, turned on the ignition, and saw the register indicate it was half full of gasoline. I knew it wasn't my car.
Oh, I see.
Then I looked down the street, and there was my Stanton.
So you figured out the professor's plan.
Lucky for both of us I did, don't you think?
Luck had nothing to do with it, Vance. Remind me never to commit a murder when you're around.
You're reminded, my friend. And incidentally, while we're on the subject, you're also reminded that this is the end of the Butler murder case.
trusted voice with engaging opinions.
You're listening to Hamilton's News. Today's talk, 900 CHML.